Okay.
You want to look to me. Mr. Nolting, what were President Kennedy's instructions to you when you left for Saigon? Did he give you an optimistic picture or pessimistic picture? And did he give you an idea of what your attitude was supposed to be?
Oh, yes. He gave me the picture of a situation which was very tricky, delicate, and uncertain. He also gave me the picture of a warning very much to use this Vietnam situation as a means to show that wars of national liberation, as Khrushchev called them, were not going to succeed, that we could help a country that was determined to help itself turn back this kind of aggression. He also was very much concerned to know whether President Diem, the head of the government then, was the kind of person on whom we could rely, and asked me particularly to try to make an assessment on that particular point. As you know, there'd been a task force in Washington right after the Kennedy inauguration to look into the situation in Vietnam and try to determine whether or not to respond to President Diem's appeal for more aid. And that task force had come up with a recommendation which President Kennedy had endorsed, that yes, we could do this, we could help them diplomatically, morally, and with material aid, but that military force was not required, and it had to be a do-it-yourself operation on the part of the Vietnamese people if it was going to be successful. So President Kennedy was optimistic, much more so, I thought, than Dean Rusk. The Secretary of State, I remember asking him about how long our tour was going to be, because of family considerations such as the children's schooling and going to college and so forth. And he said, in effect, look, Fritz, you needn't worry about that. We'll be lucky if we have a mission out there for another 6 months. So he had the feeling, I think, at least this gave me the impression that Dean Rusk felt, that it was a very touchy situation. Of course, President Kennedy was determined on this one because of a number of early setbacks. The Bay of Pigs, to begin, the dressing down, in effect, that he got from Khrushchev in the Vienna conference when they first met each other, and finally the Berlin Wall, which was a slap in the face to tripartite government or quadripartite government of Berlin. So this one was a real test. He started out drawing the line, you may recall, in Laos, and the Joint Chiefs said, in effect, if my understanding is correct, Mr. President, in no way can you do it in Laos, because you can't. There's no way to get in there and to do the kind of work necessary to preserve its independence. So Vietnam was the point.
Stop, please. Why did Dean Rusk have this feeling that Vietnam was failing fast?
I may have overstated that. I did get the impression that he felt that it was a very touchy situation. I think that he was loath to take a leadership part, so that is to have the State Department take one, so that the task force really that considered this was chaired by a Defense Department person, Ross Gilpatrick, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, you remember, at the time, with some State Department participation. I think possibly that Dean Rusk at that time was not as close to the president as he would become later on. And I also think that he felt the situation was a very difficult one.
Generally, do you think that the Kennedy administration in those early years paid enough attention to Vietnam? Was it high enough on their priorities?
I think it was high on the president's priorities, yes. I think it, and this is partly in retrospect, I think it should have been clearly stated at the beginning that it was a political problem more than a military one, a political, social, economic problem more than a military one, and I think it was a mistake that the State Department deferred to the Defense Department in the initial briefings and almost throughout my stay there.
So you're saying that in most of the time that you were in Vietnam, really it was the military that was paying more attention rather than the
Well,
defense
in
department?
personalities, excuse me, Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, was out there, or we met in Honolulu almost every month. McNamara was there very frequently. Nobody of his rank from the State Department, for example, the Secretary of State, was never there during my stay for 2.5 years.
That's a very good point. Shortly after you arrived, Lyndon Johnson came. It was the first high-level visit from the government in a long time. Did you feel that this was some sort of signal to you about your attitude towards Siem? And did Siem interpret it as a signal?
Well, Vice President Johnson and his wife and a large contingent of people from Washington came, arrived about 24 or 48 hours after we did. And this was laid on suddenly, I believe, by President Kennedy to show that he really meant business. The Vice President, as usual, was extremely vigorous and had a whirlwind visit, 4 days, shook hands with many people, made many toasts to President Siem and the government, was very bullish in his attitude. And as I'm sure you know, came out, the two governments came out with a joint communique at the end of that visit, which was a very strong communique, and it put the moral support of the United States squarely behind the effort of the South Vietnamese to put down this aggression.
Well, I guess the question is, Kennedy had said to you, go out and make your assessment yourself, be open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
But then he sends Lyndon Johnson out so quickly. Did it really tie your hands in making your mind?
No, I don't think so.
Could you include, no, I don't think Johnson's visit?
No, I don't think Johnson's visit was. I think it was a good send-off for our mission. It didn't tie my hands in any way that I then knew. It was a fact, however, that the Kennedy administration did send a lot of people all the time, and not only to Vietnam. They were people closer to President Kennedy than some of us were. He had that method of operation. He liked to send people close to him to look at what was going on in other parts of the world. Now, sometimes that got a little irksome because you had conflicting signals, but for the most part, I don't remember any instances in which there was disagreement.
Okay. Stop with the change. We have
Attorney Parker.
The Vice President's visit, Vice President Johnson and his group, came suddenly. It was a surprise to us. We knew about it just before leaving and had to leave in a hurry to get there in time. I don't think it was prejudicial. I don't think Ziem misread it. I think he needed this kind of reaction from the United States because things were, the Viet Cong had really turned on the heat. I don't think it gave him a sense of overcommitment or false commitment. My impression was that the visit was a success in boosting the morale of the South Vietnamese people to take on this greatly increased violence from the Viet Cong, which had begun about 6 months before, and they were beginning to really hurt in terms of the county, the government in the districts and provinces, and in terms of the South Vietnamese government's ability to handle it.
Let's talk about this pacification effort that I'd like it if you would express to me, as you did, that it wasn't, in your opinion, a war, but a pacification effort. At the end of '61, the president sends the Taylor-Rostow mission, and they recommend sending in military force, ground troops. Could you talk about that recommendation?
The Taylor-Rostow mission came about 6 months later, after the Johnson visit. It was intended to come up with recommendations, together with our own, the mission's recommendations, on a program to support the South Vietnamese effort. Again, not by force of arms or American combat troops, but by helping them in intelligence gathering about infiltrations and Viet Cong activities generally, in terms of economic planning and aid, in terms of technical assistance, and in every respect in which they were operating to try to pacify the country. Our instructions were to get as close to this, to all of their operations as possible, to give them advice, to get their confidence in our advice so they would carry it out. This, I think, was pretty well packaged, spelled out by the Taylor-Rostow mission, and I agreed with all of the recommendations, with the exception of the one that they added on their way back in Honolulu, and that was this force of 5,000 men, American Engineering Corps unit, which was to be self-contained and ready to fight if necessary. I think the recommendation, I remember the recommendation, was to bring them in under cover of the flood conditions in the Mekong, which at that time were quite bad. I did not approve of that because I thought it was the opening wedge for American combat forces.
What did Ziem think of those recommendations?
As I recall,
Excuse me, could you begin again, Mr. Rose?
begin, yes. Ziem felt that those recommendations were not necessary. That is, the recommendation about the 5,000-man American military force. He did not want American combat forces. In general, he said that if they couldn't win it with their own manpower, that it wouldn't be a viable solution. Of course, he wanted material help and all the support he could get short of military force.
Okay, stop. Stop, please.
Turning.
President Ziem,
It's not
excuse
a
me.
noise.
President Ziem had, in my opinion, a very
Start
okay.
again with it.
Start again.
Yes.
President Ziem had, in my opinion, a very deep insight into the character and psychology of his own people. And I think one of the things that governed many of his judgments was his sense that nationalism on the part of the South Vietnamese was going to be the major strength of their resistance to what he characterized, strangely enough, as another foreign Chinese type invasion. This dates way back, thousands of years. He would make speeches to groups of peasants talking about this new invasion under garb of a new ideology, communism. It wasn't against the North Vietnamese people, it was against what Ho Chi Minh was trying to impose on South Vietnam. His insight carried so far, I think, that he did not want to have an overwhelming American influence, and he feared an overwhelming American influence. That was one of the reasons he didn't want American combat forces. He was, to my mind, prescient in this. Some people blamed him for being too nationalistic, particularly some of our press. I think he was right. I think that his understanding of his own people was much greater than ours.
Let's do it once again and bring in the Taylor-Rostow report. If you just mentioned that in connection.
In connection with this Taylor-Rostow report, I think most parts of that report concerning, as I said, economic aid and as well as a military shield of Vietnamese forces to protect gains in the economic field and the social, educational, and the rest. He was entirely, President Diem was entirely agreeable and enthusiastic about it. I think the reason he was unenthusiastic about the 5,000-man American force was for the reasons I've just said, namely that he did not think that American influence ought to be exerted in the military sense. And one good reason for that was because it exposed him to communist propaganda. The Viet Cong would immediately have said, look, you're just going back to the French occupation again. And this they couldn't, he didn't want. I remember his getting advice from a number of people in his own cabinet and his brothers. I remember Archbishop Took, for one, saying he thought the president was exactly right on this point. He read the people's psychology the same way. Said, in effect, he thought it would be a bonanza for the Viet Cong. Does that...
Yes, this does. Stop this. I don't think they have... Tell me about Siem's reaction to the Laos agreement.
Well, the agreement on Laos, as you know, was supposed to seal that area off from the area of conflict in Southeast Asia. This was a concept, and this is what the conference in Geneva in 1962 was supposed to do. The government of South Vietnam was represented, so was the Thai government, as well as the U.S. and others on French and on British on our side, the Russians and others, North Vietnam on the other side. They worked out various proposals, starting with a position I think that was fairly sound because it had some sanctions in it. As time went on, the sanctions began to be traded away, and by the time the agreement was near completion, the South Vietnamese government, as well as the Thai government, became very uneasy that this was just going to expose their flank to further infiltration from North Vietnam and from the 30 or 40,000 troops who were North Vietnamese troops who were in Laos on the eastern borders along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So that both the Thai and the South Vietnamese government began to get very uneasy about this. We communicated their uneasiness to Washington.
We have to do a change of film. Tell us about this meeting.
Well, as the opposition of the South Vietnamese government to the agreements as finally modified in Geneva, the agreements on Laos, increased, Averell Harriman, as the principal negotiator for the United States at the Geneva conference, flew out to Saigon and had a very tough talk with President Diem. I was present. In a nutshell, what he said was that it's necessary for the South Vietnamese government to sign this agreement if they want American aid to be continued. And President Diem didn't like this being dictated to. Neither did Secretary Harriman like Diem's temerity in voicing his objections, which he did at great length. It was left that when Harriman left, that I was to do everything possible to persuade Diem to sign the agreement, which I did, somewhat against my better judgment, and he did sign it very much against his better judgment. The Thai government, in a similar position, was also convinced to sign it. I think that left some feelings of, if not antagonism, certainly some feelings of lack of mutual trust between those two people.
Do you think that lack of mutual trust, that bad feeling, came into play later when Harriman became the Assistant Secretary of State for Far East Affairs?
It seemed to me to have some effect upon the judgment of Mr. Harriman with respect to the Diem government and to Diem personally.
By 1962, there were a lot of people who were criticizing Diem, who were persuaded that he really had to go or he had to reform in some way. Did you agree with those criticisms?
Oh, the New York Times, Washington Post, certain elements in the State Department and the White House were constantly saying that there had to be political reform in the direction of more democracy in South Vietnam, and it had to come very rapidly. Otherwise, they didn't think that we ought to be supporting them, and they didn't think the South Vietnamese would win their struggle to pacify their country. In principle, everybody agreed with that. In practice, anybody that knew anything about it would realize that you had to build the infrastructure of democracy before you could build the superstructure, or before the superstructure would mean anything.
But the criticisms were quite directed towards Siem. They were saying it was his fault. How did you feel about that?
I think Siem was dedicated to running a government that was effective at the same time that he was dedicated to the long-range aim of a self-representative democratic system. I never felt that he wanted to maintain an autocracy. I felt that he himself would like to have a democratic system, but knew that it was not possible in our sense of the term for a long time until you had education, until you had a feeling of responsibility for one's own affairs. He was doing his utmost, in my opinion, to develop education. For example, 3 shifts in most of the schools. He was doing his utmost to introduce in the villages and districts elections. There was, of course, an elected assembly, but none of these measures really meant anything unless the people had the feeling of self-responsibility and self-government. And for thousands of years they hadn't had it. Under the French, they were a colony, and before that they were under a Mandarin-type society. And so the introduction of that feeling of self-responsibility and self-government was a very slow process. I do not feel, however, it was often suggested that Siem was dragging his feet on this, and strangely enough, I think his brother Nu was even more anxious to introduce self-government measures, although he had the reputation of being just the reverse.
Well, I'm interested in the question of his family, because one of the criticisms was that Siem had become a prisoner of his family, that the only people he trusted were his brothers and his family by 62, 63.
Well, I got, by that time, by 62, 63, to know him pretty well. I had many long talks with him, many long arguments. I never felt that President Siem was a prisoner of his own family or of any particular group, Roman Catholic or any other. I felt that he had a very difficult job to govern the country in a way which would not permit the Viet Cong to take over. I never felt that he was a dictator at heart. He was anything but. He had to manage, however, and it was very difficult for him to delegate. In the first place, there were not many people to whom he could delegate. And secondly, he wasn't a delegator by nature. So he tried to do too much himself. But he didn't do it in the spirit of a dictator in the Hitlerian sense.
Okay. Yes, stop for a moment here, just to give you... Could you talk a bit about Madame Nu and the kind of bad publicity she had?
Madame Nu was an enigmatic character for me, to me. She had some virtues and some weak spots. As a political person, she was very difficult. Her main motivation, her main feeling, in my opinion, was to preserve what she considered to be the ancient heritage of the Vietnamese people and not have it corrupted by any foreign influence, including American. So that she, by her speeches occasionally, by other actions, antagonized a number of Americans, and in particular the American press. I don't think that was intentional, but it was very difficult to control. And on several occasions, I had to speak with President Diem about it. He generally agreed, although she was his official hostess, he being a bachelor. And he was very close to his brother, her husband, Ngo Dinh Nhu. And it was difficult for him also.
I wanted to ask you one question about Nhu, which is a specific one. Roger Hilsman tells a story about a dinner in 1963 that he attended with Nhu, in which he claims Nhu was like a madman, raving. Were you there? Did you see any of their interaction during that visit?
I don't recall any such dinner with Hilsman and Nhu.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think I ever saw Nhu raving like a madman. It may have been a different occasion.
Did you? What about these rumors that Nhu had become power mad and so forth?
I have said before, and I repeat again, that I saw no evidence of that. I think he was loyal to his brother. I think he was more of an intriguer, mostly in connection with trying to get defections from the Viet Cong by units to the government side. And on one occasion I was in his office and he said a leader of the Viet Cong had just been here and was sitting right where you're sitting. And I said, what was that all about? And he said, I was trying to get him to come over to the government with his unit, and I think we're going to succeed. Well, President Diem knew about this.
Okay, we got to do a phone change here. We'll go.
You're going to start me out on this.
Uh-huh.
All right.
Mark.
Would you tell me this personal story again about the 62 bombing and getting there?
Well, the 62 bombing, as you recall, was done by 3 Vietnamese pilots of the Vietnamese Air Force, and it occurred early in the morning, and it sounded like a great deal of damage had been done. It was not too far from where we lived, and I went almost immediately down there to the palace, and I remember getting into some trouble with the security guards who didn't recognize me. But I finally walked in, the gate was unlocked, and I found President Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu in the garden, walking around, sort of surveying the damage to one wing of the palace. And they seemed pretty collected, cool. I think Ngo Dinh Nhu was very much worried about his wife, Madame Nhu, who had been carted off to the hospital, she having slid down a part of the collapsed building. Another thing that they were very much worried about, their smallest child, a babe in arms, had just been located, and the armor who was carrying her had been killed. She was protecting the child, and a beam had fallen on her, but the child was all right. They were very distressed about this, about the armor's death. Ngo Dinh Nhu had on the gardener's pants because he said he was still in his pajamas when this thing happened, and had borrowed a pair of pants from the gardener since he could not get back into his quarters to get it. He was walking around. President Diem had just made a talk to the nation saying that this was not a serious matter, that in terms of any uprising, and to remain calm and cool, which it turned out to be. Unlike, I might add, the previous revolt in 1960, in which there were units of the Vietnamese forces involved. This was not.
I want to come back to the question about the resident press in Vietnam. Your relations with them were somewhat cool, and could you explain why, and perhaps talk about some incident where you disagreed with them?
Well, I didn't think my relations were cool. We saw each other very frequently. I suppose what you're inquiring about is why we didn't agree. I didn't agree with the majority of the reports that came from the New York Times correspondent, who was David Halberstam, and his predecessor, Homer Bigot. I didn't agree with some of the reports that came from the two other resident reporters, who were Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press and Neil Sheehan of UPI. I think Brown was a better interpreter than either of the other two, because he could see the nuances of the situation so much better. I think the New York Times was generally against U.S. support of the Diem government, and later against the government itself, for reasons which I never quite understood, but which may have been mentioned earlier, and that is that they weren't getting on with what they termed democracy fast enough. And I've already said why I thought that was an unreasonable position. I do know that some of the New York Times editorials critical of the Diem government were broadcast from Hanoi in its propaganda efforts to undermine the Diem government. The editorials themselves written in New York.
What about, for example, the Battle of Atbaq, a famous example of reporting? Did you agree with the reports on Atbaq, or did you agree with the military's assessment?
I think the Battle of Atbaq was a very poor show on the part of the South Vietnamese units that were involved. I don't think they acquitted themselves well. I think it was an exception, however. Generally, they acquitted themselves much better and sometimes brilliantly, and they were courageous. In this case, they weren't, and whether it was a failure of local leadership or what, I've never been sure of. I do think the Battle of Atbaq was blown out of all proportion by the American press, and should have been treated as a setback, a very unfortunate setback at an unfortunate time, but not as a symbol of Vietnamese cowardice.
Stop, please, yes.
Just two more questions.
Can you describe Mansfield's visit to Saigon and his report and Diem's reaction?
Yes, Senator Mansfield and two other senators came. They were on a tour of the Far East. They came to Saigon. The visit was very unfortunate, in my view, because of the report that Senator Mansfield made the covering letter of that report public. And it was severely critical of his old friend, President Diem. In fact, I regard the Mansfield report as the first nail in Diem's coffin. Why did Senator Mansfield do it? Why did he assess the situation that way? I am not sure. I know that he had very little to do with the embassy and would not didn't want many briefings. I know that he had a lot to do and spent a lot of time with the American press representatives. And I think he was over-influenced by them, in my opinion. His assistant, Frank Vallejo, was certainly not either cordial or helpful to the members of our mission. And I think Frank Vallejo was prejudiced. And I think Senator Mansfield came up with the wrong conclusion.
And you told me a story about Ziem's reaction to it, that he was disappointed, but he wouldn't let it.
Yes. I talked to President Ziem the next day or right after this release, and he said, Mao, I'm terribly disappointed in what my old friend had to say about my government and myself, such as being divorced from the people. But he said, I am not going to let it stand in the way of a friendship that has existed ever since I was in the United States.
Okay, stop, please. Can you describe the change in policy that came in with Harriman and Hillsman?
Well, when Mr. Harriman took over as Secretary for the Far East, I did begin to perceive a change in the American attitude, in the State Department's attitude towards the Ziem government. My instructions were never basically changed. They were, as I've said, to create confidence and try to use that confidence to get them to do the things that would improve their situation. We've spoken of a certain possible lack of confidence between Harriman and Ziem arising earlier. My job was made more difficult. This change was gradual, and there were factions in the State Department. Some thought we ought to stick to the old line, but I have the feeling that Harriman became very impatient with the old line, and impatient with those of us who were trying to carry it out. I remember asking him on one occasion whether he had read the instructions under which I was sent out there by President Kennedy. And he said, well, I know what it's all about. I don't have to read instructions of that kind. And I said, well, if we're going to have a change, let's have it openly so we can debate it and talk about whether it's wise to do so. No, this was more feeling of that. The telegrams took on a different tone. They took on a peremptory tone. And why don't you tell him to do this, that, or the other? Well, we were not in position, nor was our assignment to tell him. It was to try to convince him. I think Harriman was discouraged, was not discouraged, but was determined to get on with this thing at a faster rate. And I think a part of that was his political instinct to get Kennedy reelected.
Okay, stop.
Right. Stand by just a moment. Yes.
I had the feeling, a very definite feeling, that Secretary Harriman became more and more impatient with the slow process, the slow progress that we thought and Washington felt was occurring in Vietnam. I think he wanted to get on with it in much more of a hurry than most of us thought was possible. I think that a part of this was his natural impatience, and a part of it was to get a resounding success, if you will, for political reasons in the re-election of President Kennedy. I think that was an unrealistic attempt, and for my part, I was disappointed to see this faction opening up in the State Department. It became very confusing to the people in the field to know really who was calling the signals.
Greg, can we put a tail mark on? Turning marker.
541.
Well, speaking of the
What took place?
crucial arguments, as I consider them, crucial debates in the NSC in late August and early September, which were the only ones I attended, I should say a couple of things. Number one, I was no longer ambassador and had no official position with respect to Vietnam. I was, however, invited to those meetings by President Kennedy or Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, or through one of their people, because I had a point of view quite different from what was being argued by the State Department, and what had in fact been already signaled to Senator Lodge, to Ambassador Lodge, excuse me. And they wanted to hear this other side. At times the argument, the discussion became hot and heavy. At times some words were said by Mr. Harriman, whom on previous occasions I had found, and over the years, a delightful friend. But he was very impatient with what I had to say, and I think it has been reported, and so there's no reason not to say that he would shout across the table and say, "Shut up," when I was speaking. So much so that on one occasion I recall the President had to say, "Averill, I want to hear what Nolting has to say." These were meetings at which the majority of the State Department were for a change. The reading of the CIA was against a change, although they were not in a policy position. The reading of the military was against a change. The reading of certain members of the White House staff were for a change. That is, for a coup, or change in American policy, which would likely bring about a coup. I do not think the thing was well coordinated. Certainly, it was a series of meetings after which nobody quite knew what the president wanted to do. Then he made a talk, you remember, before Walter Cronkite, in which he said we might be calling for a change in policy and perhaps in personnel, or not we would be calling, but they perhaps should make change in policy and perhaps in personnel. These were indications of a decided change, and they were taken very hard in Saigon by the Siem government. Another symbol, of course, was the asylum that was given to Tik Tri Quang in the U.S. Embassy, and that symbol was very, very strong. My own view was that even at that point, we would have done much better to stick with the constitutional government, or at the very least, to have let them know that our policy was changing. I don't think it was fair, just, or honorable to an ally of 9 years to do this behind his back. And for myself, I am convinced that that change in policy at the end of the Kennedy administration was the thing that got us locked into this unnecessary and disastrous war. My feelings about the August 24 telegram sent to Ambassador Lodge were, number one, that it was an uncoordinated, badly drafted, and badly conceived paper. I think also it was put through by those who were determined to have a change of government in Saigon. And they were by no means the telegram was uncoordinated, as I've said. It forced the hands of the American government because the signal was almost immediately delivered by Lodge to the generals. It became the major focus of debate in the National Security Council meetings that I attended. It represented at the time nobody's considered opinion, with the exception perhaps of the drafters and those that approved it, and who were quite few. To turn back the clock, however, was very difficult, and President Kennedy realized that. Those of us who argued that this would lead us to further involvement and would lead us into having the responsibility for the major military effort were unable, unfortunately, to convince President Kennedy of that. I think principally because nobody could see a way of turning the clock back. To my mind, that telegram plus the arguments in the NSC and their outcome, which again was a rather uncoordinated thing, led to the overthrow of the only government that had a chance of pulling this thing out, and was the crucial turning point in our involvement in the military field, in the major military responsibility in this unnecessary war. I might say one other thing which has been on my mind for a long time, and that is that this action was not only very ill-considered as a political move, but it was dishonorable. At the very least, we should have let our ally of 9 years know that we were pulling the rug from under him, and we didn't. And this is something that I found very difficult to swallow.